Hello, my name is Dr. Sakinah Davis, and I'd like to welcome you to this pre-show talk for the groundbreaking American opera, Porgy and Bess. Porgy and Bess, as many of you know, is an opera composed by George Gershwin, set to a libretto by DuBose Hayward, and it's actually coming up on its 86th anniversary this September. The story of Porgy and Bess centers on the South Carolinian community, Catfish Row, located within Charleston, South Carolina, and it focuses on the blossoming romance of Porgy, a physically impaired beggar, and Bess, a beautiful woman living a tormented, fast-paced life. Now, from the very inception of the opera, Porgy and Bess has been the center of much celebration and controversial debate. Speaking of the controversy, when it first came out in 1935, many critics were wondering, is it opera? Is it musical theater? Another conversation that continues to be discussed has to do with the matters of whether or not George Gershwin and DuBose Hayward appropriated African American culture, or whether their work was a celebration and appreciation of the African American experience. Regarding celebratory moments within Porgy and Bess history, it is known for breaking racial barriers in many ways. One of the most significant ways in which it broke racial barriers, starting in 1935, was the refusal of the original cast to perform for segregated audiences, and as a result, many theaters and opera houses within the United States were integrated. The most recent celebration within Porgy and Bess history is the fact that the 2019-2020 Met production of the opera just recently won a Grammy for Best Opera Recording. So with all of this history of celebration and controversy and debate, you can tell that it's kind of difficult to pick one specific topic on which you can dig in when talking about the nuts and bolts of Porgy and Bess. What I chose to focus on for today's discussion, however, is a topic that I feel as a performer and as an audience member is not focused on enough. The very inspiration of the opera itself, the Gullah community of South Carolina. Now, in general, productions of Porgy and Bess are celebrations that highlight the overall contribution of the Southern African American experience to American music and culture. However, in conversations about the production or in the very productions themselves, there is often very little attention given to the nuance and unique history of the Gullah community on which the opera was based. And so that's what I'd like to focus on for today's conversation. Who are the Gullah people of South Carolina? What about this community did Hayward and Gershwin feel was so powerful and attractive that they wanted to center their story on these real lived experiences? And finally, what do Gullah people think about Porgy and Bess? How have they in recent years gone about reclaiming the narrative that was established by Gershwin and Hayward? So, let's go. First things first, we have to figure out who we're talking about. Who are the Gullah people? Who is the Gullah community? To answer that question, we have to do a little bit of historical digging. The Gullah people are descendants of enslaved Africans that were brought over to the South Atlantic coast that includes present-day North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida as early as 1526. They were brought over in many cases as enslaved Africans to work the rice, indigo, and cotton plantations that fueled a lot of the Southern economy during the 17th and 19th centuries. Most of the Gullah community are descendants of Africans brought over from the Western African coast. So that includes present-day Sierra Leone, the Senegambian region, which you see is circled right here, and further south on the western coast, including present-day Angola and the Congo. So again, many of these enslaved Africans were from rice agricultural economies themselves in the African continent and were brought over to use those skills to harvest rice, indigo, and cotton in the New World. Again, in the South Atlantic, you have a lot of coastal plantations as well as island plantations, which are a little bit more isolated. And these enslaved Africans were brought over to work these places. Eventually, some of the Africans who were enslaved became freed through escaping or through eventual emancipation of slavery within the United States. Some of them moved further into more urban spaces on the mainland, but a lot of them stayed on these island spaces. As a result of the circumstances of what brought the ancestors of the Gullah people to the South Atlantic coast, you get a couple of very interesting situations. First, you have this ethnic mix of African peoples from all over the western coast, and that mix creates a kind of cultural sharing or syncretism and blending. Also, with the island locations of these plantations, there's a certain isolation from the rest of the United States. And with that ethnic mix and the isolation, you get the development of a unique culture that has a much higher rate of African retentions than most African descendant cultures within the interior of the U.S. So now that we've gotten a little bit of background about the history of the Gullah people, now I want to talk about some aspects of Gullah culture that are featured prominently within the story Porgy and the opera Porgy and Bess. The first one is language. Now, there are some common misconceptions that I want to address about Gullah language. First, Gullah has been conceived as broken English spoken by ignorant or infantile, uneducated people. That is a gross misconception and is completely false. Also, another misconception is that Gullah in its entirety is a dialect or an accent. Though, of course, Gullah speakers have an accent when they speak English, this isn't quite correct either. According to the Gullah Geechee Corridor, Gullah is the only distinctly African Creole language in the United States. What that means is that there are multiple roots from a multitude of African languages that are still traceable within Gullah today, and that Creole indicates that mix. Gullah is English-based Creole and began as the simplified form of communication among African peoples who spoke many different languages, and this includes words from other European languages, including French. The phrases and words in Gullah can be directly traced by scholars to Mende and Fula roots in the Creole language spoken today in Sierra Leone. So there's a clear connection with the Gullah language to the wider African diaspora. So in the clip you're about to see, you're going to hear an example of Gullah being spoken by the storyteller Teresa Jenkins Hilliard in this video distributed by the National Geographic Foundation.
Well, I day the dinner for tell Huna something about my ancestor them. I can feel the presence there to deal with me now, cause I know to watch over me. He strip everything from her. All the children that snatch out the arm, carry the baby this way, the mad that way, the pad that way. And them in they had no sense of family at all.
So in this very short clip, it's probably hard to get a general sense of the Gullah language. However, there are some things I want you to bring your attention to. First, in the first clip that we listened to, she said the word huna, which indicates you. I'm talking to you. And that word, scholars have directly linked to the Creole language of Sierra Leone. It's still used with that definition today. Also, in the second clip, when she's talking about the mother and the father, she uses the words mère and père. Those are French words. So what we're seeing here again are clear examples of how Gullah is not broken English. It is a complex language with many linguistic examples and its own system of syntax and grammar. So now that we've talked a little bit about the Gullah language, let's talk about Gullah music traditions. So, typical musical characteristics that you'll hear in Gullah traditional music are those of call and response, communal singing, particularly around spiritual worship, harmony, oral tradition, so unarranged music that's not transcribed, a cappella music as well, and shouting. Now, most of these characteristics are typical within African American and folk genres of the U.S. One that kind of helps Gullah music traditions to stand out is the tradition of shouting. Now, shouting isn't just about raising the voice. Shouting is also about a certain rhythmic complexity with clapping and foot stomping that you see performed often in different Gullah genres, including the traditional Gullah spirituals and the ring shout. There is a specific rhythm often that you hear when people are shouting in these contexts, and that rhythm has been called a number of things. Some people call it the Charleston rhythm. Some people call it a shouting rhythm. Some people, if you're a Latin American or Caribbean scholar, call it the tresillo, but it sounds something like this. So it's highly syncopated. And what I want you to think about as you listen to the following examples is whether or not you can hear where that rhythm surfaces. This first example we're going to be listening to is sung by the Mount Zion Spiritual Singers of Charleston, South Carolina, led by Alfonso Brown, who is also the founder of Charleston's Gullah Tours.
Hey, Lord, 'cause the time is drawing now. Sing along, hey, Lord, I see the sign of judgment. Hey, Lord, I see the sign of judgment. What a time is going now. I see the sign. Oh, I see the sign. Over there. I see the sign. 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 I see the sign of judgment.
So in that clip, the rhythm that I spoke of was heard very faintly. Maybe one or two clappers were doing it, but it was present. A more clear example of this rhythm is in the next video we're going to be watching, which is of the McIntosh County Shouters from McIntosh, Georgia. Remembering again that Gullah traditions and Gullah music and language is not limited to South Carolina, but is spread all along the South Atlantic coast, though of course there are differences based on region.
Move, Daniel, move. Daniel. Move, Daniel, move. Daniel. Oh, Lord, where's Santa gone? Oh, Lord, Santa gone to hell. Shout, Daniel, shout. Daniel. 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 Santa in my way. Daniel. Santa in my way.
So one thing I want to bring up is that when we're talking about musical characteristics that make it into Porgy and Bess, it is important to note that George Gershwin and DuBose Hayward were more immersed in the tradition of Gullah spirituals, according to historical accounts, than they were of the ring shout. Gullah spirituals are more located within the Christian church, while the ring shout is a bit more of a syncretic form that has influences from Islamic communities in South Carolina, as well as non-monotheistic traditional African religions that came over with the ancestors of the Gullah people. However, while you have these two examples, is to show the pervasiveness of that specific rhythm, that quote-unquote Charleston rhythm. And this rhythm was so pervasive that it really was the foundation of what spurred that dance craze in the early 20th century, the Charleston. Also, George Gershwin had some kind of contact with this rhythm before he started working on Porgy and Bess, because it's featured prominently in his 1925 piano concerto in F. So now that we have a general idea of the history of the Gullah people, some background about the language that is featured within the novel and the opera, as well as the music, it is important to hone in on what inspired George Gershwin and DuBose Hayward to really include this community within their works. It's important to also realize that Gershwin and Hayward weren't exactly anomalies for being interested in African American culture in the early 20th century. White American consumption of quote-unquote American Negro culture was pretty standard at this time for a number of reasons. One had to be a sense of nationalism, trying to figure out what the American sound was. Many people turned to African Americans for that. There's also a sense of nostalgia, with a lot of things changing with the aftermath of the Civil War and World War I, as well as a sense of exoticism, seeing the African American as something that was different and new that needed to be explored. What makes Gershwin and Hayward stand out from their colleagues and peers is they had a higher dedication to authenticity and featuring Black artists in their works that was not typical for white composers and librettists of the time. So let's look at DuBose and Dorothy Hayward. In the novel Porgy, which was published in 1925, DuBose Hayward depicts the story of a community of African Americans in South Carolina, much of which is influenced by Gullah culture. This novel was adapted into a play by Dorothy Hayward in 1927. The Haywards, particularly DuBose, was part of a Southern literary or Charleston literary renaissance, and he wrote multiple stories on Gullah themes based on real people and occurrences. His interest in depicting Gullah culture was echoed in white elite circles in Charleston as a kind of regionalism. These circles felt that the Gullah language and music was part of what made Charleston and South Carolina unique. It was pervasive, so much so that a number of white Charlestonians could recognize, or in some situations even speak Gullah, because they were surrounded by it because of the proximity of Gullah communities within Charleston, whether it be as business owners or in positions of servitude, etc. So he felt that it was really his job or his duty in some ways to promote Gullah culture as a South Carolinian and Charlestonian. So let's look at Catfish Row. Many opera enthusiasts already know that Catfish Row is based on the real-life African-American community of Cabbage Row, which was, at the 1920s, a tenement housing building for multiple families who were descendants of African-American freedmen or freed slaves, and it was named for the selling of cabbages by its inhabitants. DuBose and Dorothy Hayward actually lived down the street from Cabbage Row, and as a result, they were able to closely observe and be inspired by everyday occurrences of that community. And that is how DuBose Hayward came across figures like Goat Cart Sam, who inspired the character Porgy, as well as the street vendors that were featured prominently within the novel and the opera. So, an interesting comment was made by Joseph Horowitz of The American Scholar. And he said that DuBose Hayward's work is part cultural anthropology, part romanticized mythology. So that's a very interesting contrast. And what I believe it means is that DuBose Hayward grounded his work in inspiration from real lived experiences of Gullah people living in Charleston. And again, that's how you get the famed use of the street vendors, the strawberry woman, the honey man, and community figureheads like Samuel Goat Cart Sam Smalls. That's the cultural anthropology part. The romanticized mythology part has to do with this kind of heroism and, in some ways, mysticism and bordering on exoticism that DuBose Hayward uses to depict these lived experiences. So when we talk about authenticity, as far as what DuBose Hayward saw and experienced, it's definitely relative because it's seen through a romanticized lens that takes artistic license. Examples would be the transformation of the real-life goat cart peddler Samuel Smalls, who was known within African-American communities in Charleston as being a mean drunk, with a beautiful singing voice and very charming, but also was very violent. He actually came to DuBose Hayward's attention for running away from the police because he shot a woman in the middle of the street. And DuBose Hayward takes this real-lived figure and turns him into a heroic figure for his novel. Another example of this use of reality, and that was kind of either filtered out or pictured and framed in a different way, is the use of the Gullah language within the novel, and therefore the opera. The Gullah language was used as evocative of the general soundscape of what Charleston would have sounded like in the 1920s. However, because Hayward and eventually Gershwin were catering toward audiences that spoke standard American English and knew very little about Gullah culture, let alone the language, the inclusion of Gullah language was increasingly diminished from the novel to the play and then to the opera libretto. And eventually, in many productions, you don't really get many references or understandings of the Gullah language at all. Now that we've talked about some of the influences and negotiations of Hayward and Gullah culture within his work, let's look at what George Gershwin did. George Gershwin was very ambitious as a composer and a young man, and he really wanted to write an opera immersed in the American experience that fueled and fused popular music and classical idioms. In a quote from the Gershwin Reader, George Gershwin says that American music is something indigenous. It's deeply rooted in our soil. It must be a voice of the masses and at the same time immortalizing their strivings. So in this quote, we get the foundational echoes of what drives George Gershwin to look to jazz as America's music. Gershwin was born in Brooklyn, but he spent a lot of time in Harlem in jazz musical spaces. He felt like jazz was America's music and therefore was enamored with the art form and with the African American artists that composed and performed it. He also, through these jazz musical spaces, had his potential first encounters with what we called the Charleston sound and that Charleston rhythm. His dedication to exploring American music for his opera project also brings up questions of authenticity and what he understood to be appropriate. So Kendra Hamilton, a literary scholar, discussed George Gershwin as saying that he felt that jazz opera should be, quote unquote, Negro opera. This statement essentially means that jazz, being America's music, is founded within the African American experience. Therefore, jazz opera needs to feature the African American experience and African American singers. Otherwise, it might be a little absurd. So here again, we are seeing more direct reasons why, to this day, the Gershwin estate still stipulates that Porgy and Bess be performed by an all-black cast. Though Gershwin was trying to write a jazz opera, he did, at the encouragement of DuBose Hayward, do some studies within Gullah musical traditions in South Carolina. He made two well-known visits that were highly documented because Gershwin was a big name coming from New York. And he spent quite a bit of time on the South Carolinian coast in Charleston and on various island spaces like Wadmalaw and Johns Island. He made some well-known visits to Macedonia AME Church to listen to music there, to a church on Folly Beach, which will be mentioned later, and he also connected with the Society for the Preservation of Spirituals, an interesting phenomenon in that it was run and created by white elite Charlestonians who were dedicated to the transcription, recording, and performance of traditional Gullah spirituals in the Gullah language. So as a result of George Gershwin's musical studies in Charleston, South Carolina, he gets more than just a jazz opera. He gets an opera that has a fusion of multiple African American music forms featuring a number of prominent Gullah characteristics. One being this shouting rhythm that we talked about before. Ba, 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 ba. There are multiple moments within Porgy and Bess where this rhythm comes up as a driving force for the music and for the orchestral score, but I feel like the clearest example is in the finale, Oh Lord, I'm on My Way. In this performance, it's featuring bass baritone Willard White as Porgy from the 1993 film production of the opera. So again, that rhythm was featured prominently not just within the percussion of the orchestral score, but also the strings and other instruments as a foundation of that example. Another example that we have of Gershwin's direct influence from Gullah culture is his fusion of the Gullah spiritual and what he called a Holy Rollers church influence that became the hurricane scene featuring Oh Dr. Jesus. In Charleston, George Gershwin heard the spiritual Oh Dr. Jesus, and then he went in a different visit to Hendersonville, North Carolina, right along the state lines of North Carolina and South Carolina, and saw what he saw, what considered a Holy Rollers experience, in which there was a very fervent church service and participants in congregation was speaking in tongues, which was very new for him. He combined this religious fervor and the spiritual that he was so taken with within the hurricane scene of Porgy and Bess, which is one of the most powerful moments of the opera. And this recording you're going to hear is from the 1976 Grammy Award-winning Houston Grand Opera recording. And so, what I hope that you got from these connections of these stories of Hayward and Gershwin were how they were directly influenced by different Gullah characteristics during their production and development of the Porgy and Bess project. So now we see again some more specificity in how Gullah culture shows up within the work. Now that we've talked about the history of the Gullah people in general and how DuBose, Hayward, and George Gershwin saw them and included them in their work, now I want to talk about a little bit of the Gullah perspective itself, particularly when it comes to Porgy and Bess. Now, while George Gershwin and DuBose Hayward had seemingly the best of intentions, and I truly do believe that, they were still viewing Porgy and Bess and viewing this Gullah community from a limited lens, being that they were not of African American or Gullah descent, and also being that it was the 1920s. So there were still racial superiority, issues of racial superiority that was very much integrated and accepted within culture. And so because of the fact that Porgy and Bess got so famous, many people who weren't aware of Gullah culture got their first view through the perspectives of Hayward and Gershwin. And while that is definitely better than nothing, it also is a limited lens that doesn't give you the fullest picture. Nowadays, a lot of Gullah artists and activists and politicians alike are working to reclaim that narrative from that outsider's gaze and speak about what the Gullah perspective is for themselves. Speaking of that perspective within Porgy and Bess, I have two examples. One from the 1970 Charleston production of Porgy and Bess, and one from the more recent Spoleto production in 2016. So a lot of the information I got about this production came from, again, Mr. Alfonso Brown, who was featured in the video with the Mount Zion Spiritual Singers, and from materials coming from the upcoming documentary When Porgy Came Home by Lauren Waring Douglas. So there had been no Charleston production of Porgy and Bess until 1970, 35 years after the work was premiered in Boston and New York, and had since traveled the world. Now, this delayed progress was due to segregation laws of South Carolina, And there was a failed attempt to mount the production in the 1950s, but ultimately there could not be an agreement that was struck. The cast refused to perform for a segregated audience, and South Carolina refused to integrate its houses. So, 1970s production was a slew of firsts. The first production of Porgy and Bess within Charleston, the very place which it was inspired. And also, it was the first amateur production of the opera. There were about 120, 125 cast members in total, and they were not professional opera singers. They did have vocal training. The meat of the chorus was made by the Choraleers Music Club of Charleston, South Carolina, but they were not professional opera singers, and that was very new for Porgy and Bess. Even the original cast was made up of professional, classically trained operatic singers. This was very different. Another first was that the cast of Porgy and Bess for the 1970 Charleston production, including the principals, was made up entirely of Charlestonians. The first time this had ever happened in the history of the opera. And so what that gives us is a very unique perspective and a unique experience of the opera.
Ellen Gerber found out about the Choraleers Music Club and chose us to be the choral of Porgy and Bess.
So it was a coming together of us who really sang and knew music and could read music.
Porgy and Bess production involved a whole lot of singing, and being a part that we love to sing, we fit right in.
Here's a group from Charleston. They didn't have to import folks into the Low Country. The talent was already here.
And since it was local, all of us were determined to make this a great thing. And we wanted to make Charleston proud of us.
It was like a movie, except it was real. And when they started to sing, I was like, I know that song. And the crowd loved it. And at the end, the ovation just went on and on.
There was a great authenticity to this production that I have never seen elsewhere.
It just melted Ellen Gerber's heart. She directed that Porgy and Bess many times. And for the first time, she saw it real.
And so the name that was mentioned in the documentary as far as the director was that of Ella Gerber. And what Ella Gerber brought to this production was openness to the expertise of Gullah culture inherent within the Charlestonian cast. All the Charlestonian African-American cast did not necessarily identify as Gullah. However, because of their proximity to Gullah communities, some of them were Gullah, and some of them also were very familiar with the cadence of the Gullah language and the musical characteristics that were pervasive within all of Charleston society. So Ella Gerber often consulted the cast members over the score and the libretto, and she gave them license as a director to infer the intentions of the composer and librettist. So Mr. Alfonso Brown, who was a member of that chorus, said that there would be times where the chorus members or cast members would say, I see what Gershwin and Hayward were trying to do here, but that's not how we would say it. And Ella Gerber would in turn ask them how they would say it, and they would inform her. And she would say, let's include it in the production. Therefore, this collaborative relationship incorporated much more Gullah cultural nuance, including more presence of Gullah language and words and phrases, and more musical characteristics from Gullah communities, including the prevalence of the shouting, the clapping, and the foot stomping throughout the opera in places where it was not even indicated in the score. This openness to allowing the Gullah community and Gullah people to put their own voice and perspective within the opera was within the spirit of Gershwin, who allowed his African-American cast to improvise and include their own nuances within the works that he wrote. So now I want to look at the more recent 2016 Spoleto production. This production was done to a production design by famed South Carolinian painter Jonathan Green, who focuses on Gullah themes in most of his works. So Jonathan Green has been described as impressionistic, giving this idea of how Gullah people might see themselves: vibrant, lively, connected to nature in a spiritual sense. And it also includes nods to African retentions in the symbols and fabric patterns that you see in the image to your left. So a typical production design of Porgy and Bess looks something like this. This is the Met production in 2019. So note that the colors are a little bit muted, and the depiction is working toward being a realistic view of what Catfish Row or Cabbage Row looked like in the 1920s in Charleston. Green's production design, on the other hand, is much different. What you notice is there's much more vibrancy of color, and also notice that there are a lot of patterns that evoke and give nods to patterns of African fabric and African retentions. There are also a lot of architectural inclusions that come from Gullah and African American culture within South Carolina, including the famed wrought iron gates made by Gullah blacksmiths. So this is a very different production. And for some critics, they were confused. They thought this was not realistic. They thought that this is not what DuBose, Hayward, and Gershwin were trying to depict. They thought that African Americans and Gullah peoples did not live and dress and move about like this in the early 20th century. So what was Green's rationale for this? Jonathan Green himself was born and raised in a Gullah community outside of Charleston. And his experience as part of that community was that Gullah people were very proud of who they were and how they presented themselves. Though financially they did not have a lot of money, many of them at the time had a lot of land wealth and were very proud in who they were. So even if they had little material wealth, they always went out with a very put together, if you will, presentation of themselves and how they looked. So as someone from the Gullah community, when he saw the typical production design of Porgy and Bess, he did not feel like that was a reflection of how Gullah people actually see themselves. So that was a question that he asked when he made this production design. Another question that he asked, to push it a little further, was this idea of a reimagined reality. So if Gullah people had been part of a history that did not include enslavement, what would have they dressed like? What would they have acted like if they had come to the U.S. of their own free will? What would have been the African retentions they had been able to keep? And how would they carry themselves? So I think that this concept of reimagined reality and how Gullah people see themselves from that perspective is very powerful, because again, often what we get from Porgy and Bess is the perspective of two very talented and well-meaning white American men. And very seldom do we get the perspective of the Gullah community itself. And that's what Jonathan Green tried to do in his 2016 production. And that's what Ella Gerber was very open to allowing and embracing with the Charlestonian cast of the 1970 production. So, as we end our discussion of Porgy and Bess and its connections to the Gullah community, what I really hope that I was able to do today is, one, expose you to more information and history about this wonderful, vibrant American culture. And I also hope that this exposure gives you more of an interest into diving in and discovering more about the Gullah communities along the South Atlantic coast, particularly in South Carolina. What I also hope that this shows is how important opera can be as a means of representation, often for marginalized groups. It's very interesting when you see composers like Bizet or Delibes or Gershwin feeding their curiosity and following their interest in cultures outside of their own. And they do that using the medium of opera. We as audience members and performers can take that curiosity a few steps further and really dig in and find out what are the lived experiences of the very people that these beautiful works are written about. It's also important to understand that as we enjoy the beautiful music and performances of Porgy and Bess, that we are aware that Gershwin and Hayward were writing about living, breathing people whose descendants are still alive today and unfortunately are experiencing difficulties with the eventual decay of the Gullah language as it is used less and less, as well as loss of land due to gentrification and increased building of land resorts. So I think it's very important that we keep this human connection that opera provides us, both on the stage, in the theater, and outside as well, so that we can bring more and more communities and conversations to the table. I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation, and I hope that you enjoy New Orleans Opera Association's production of Porgy and Bess. Stay safe, and thank you for joining me.